The dining room of Auberge Sainte-Hélène smelled the way old money always does: cedar, white truffle, and the faint chemical sweetness of someone's very expensive perfume failing to mask their anxiety. It was a Wednesday evening in late October, and the room was full in the way that only mattered if you understood what full meant in a place like this. Every table taken, every bottle chilled, every server moving with the particular kind of controlled efficiency that guests like these expected without ever acknowledging. Sylvie Marchand was refilling the water at table 7 when she heard him before she saw him. "Non, not there," I said the corner table. I said it explicitly. She didn't look up. She had learned, in 3 years at Auberge Sainte-Hélène, that looking up too quickly at a raised voice was the fastest way to become its next target. She finished pouring, set the carafe down gently, and only then turned toward the entrance, where Maître de François was performing the particular kind of graceful apology that only the best dining rooms in Montreal teach their staff. The man at the center of the commotion was tall, broad-shouldered, in the way of someone who paid for that particular silhouette, and wearing a suit that Sylvie recognized from a magazine she had flipped through at the dentist's office the previous spring. Maximilien Gaultier. She knew the name before she knew the face, because everyone in the city knew the name. Founder of Gaultier Capital, the private equity firm that had, in the past 18 months, quietly acquired 4 of Montreal's most beloved mid-range restaurant groups and turned them into something sleeker, colder, and considerably less beloved. He was 47. He had been photographed once shaking hands with the premier, and once leaving a charity gala with a woman who was not his wife, though the second photograph had been far less widely circulated. François guided him to the corner table. Sylvie's station. She smoothed the front of her apron and walked over. There were 4 of them. Gaultier, 2 men she didn't recognize but whose postures announced junior associates clearly enough, and a woman in her 50s with silver hair cut very short and the expression of someone who had attended too many dinners, exactly like this one. "Good evening," Sylvie said, placing the menus. "Welcome to Auberge Sainte-Hélène. My name is Sylvie, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I begin with still or sparkling water?" Gaultier didn't look at her. He was already studying his phone. "Sparkling," one of the junior associates said quickly. He glanced at Sylvie with the brief, apologetic smile of a man who had learned to compensate socially for whoever he worked for. "Of course. And for the table, would you like a moment with the wine list, or—" "We'll need the sommelier," Gaultier said, still without looking up. "Not the server." "Absolutely," Sylvie said. "I'll send Thierry right over." She walked to the service station and relayed the message to Thierry, who nodded and straightened his jacket with the weary resignation of a man who had also, in 3 years, learned what certain kinds of requests meant. Sylvie took her time restocking the breadbasket for table 9. She was good at taking her time. She had learned patience the way most people learn it. Not by choice, but by necessity. She had been 26 when she left McGill's Faculty of Law, 14 months into her 2nd year, on a Tuesday morning in March, that she still remembered with a precision that surprised her. Her mother had called at 7:43 a.m. before Sylvie's administrative law seminar, and had said, very quietly, the way her mother always delivered difficult things, without drama, as if keeping her voice level could keep the news from being true. They found something on the scan. They want to do a biopsy Thursday. The biopsy had confirmed what the scan suggested. The treatment that followed had been aggressive and expensive in the ways that aggressive cancer treatment is always expensive, even with provincial coverage, even with supplementary insurance, because there are always the costs that don't appear in the brochures. The parking at the Chum, the meals her mother couldn't cook, the medications that bridged the gaps, the weeks Sylvie's younger brother, Theodore, couldn't work because someone needed to be there, and Sylvie was the one who had always, in their small family of 3, been the one who could manage the practical things. She had taken a leave of absence. The leave had extended. The money from her part-time tutoring and her student line of credit had not been sufficient, and the position at Auberge Sainte-Hélène had paid what it paid, which was more than most, and had offered the flexibility she needed during her mother's treatment schedule. Her mother was in remission now, had been for 11 months. The debt was not. Sylvie was 29 years old, and she was very good at her job, and she was carrying approximately $64,000 in combined student debt and medical adjacent expenses, and on most nights, the dining room of Auberge Sainte-Hélène was simply the place where she worked. She was professional about it. She was even, on some nights, genuinely happy here. The rhythm of a well-run service had its own satisfaction, the same way a clean legal argument had its own satisfaction, and she had come to understand that these things were not so different. Maximilien Gaultier was not going to be one of the easy tables. She knew this the way you know weather. Thierry returned from the corner table 12 minutes later, with an order for a bottle of 2018 Domaine Les Flives Puligny Montrachet that made Sylvie quietly revise her estimate of the evening's bill, and the additional information, delivered in a murmur, that the gentleman at the corner had asked that his water glass be replaced because it had a smudge. Sylvie held the glass up to the service light. It was clean. She brought a new one anyway. The first hour passed in the way that difficult tables always pass, with a specific kind of careful attention that looks, from the outside, identical to the careful attention you give any table, but costs considerably more. Gaultier sent back his amuse-bouche without comment, simply pushing the small slate plate to the edge of the table. He interrupted Sylvie mid-description of the evening's duck confit to ask whether the kitchen was using the same supplier they'd had 6 months ago, and when she said she would confirm with the chef, he looked at her for the first time directly and said, "You don't know. I'll find out for you right away," she said. "You don't know," he repeated, as though she hadn't spoken, turning back to his associates. "This is what happens when you put people in positions they're not equipped for." The silver-haired woman, whose name Sylvie had gathered was Helene, and who worked in something adjacent to real estate law, looked briefly at the tablecloth. Sylvie went to the kitchen. The chef confirmed the supplier hadn't changed. She relayed this. Gaultier received the information without acknowledgement. The junior associates ordered. Helene ordered with a quiet politeness that felt like a small apology for the company she kept. Gaultier studied the menu for 4 additional minutes after everyone else had ordered, then looked up and said, "The halibut, but I want to know how it's being prepared before I commit." Sylvie described the preparation, pan-seared, with a saffron beurre blanc, served over celery root puree with a fennel salad. "Saffron," he repeated. "In a beurre blanc. That's an unusual choice. Chef Biozalel has been working with it for the fall menu. The sweetness complements the—" "I didn't ask for a lecture," he said. She stopped. "I asked for information. There's a difference." He handed the menu back to her without looking at her again. "I'll have the halibut." She wrote it down. She walked back to the service station. She pressed the heel of her hand flat against the cool metal of the counter for a moment, not because she needed to collect herself. She had collected herself. She was entirely collected, but because sometimes the body needs a second to confirm what the mind has already decided, which is that this is simply a table and she has managed difficult tables before, and she will manage this one. What she did not know in that moment was that the table was about to become something else entirely. It happened during the main course. The halibut had arrived, perfectly executed, as Chef Beausoleil's food always was, and Sylvie was checking on table 11 when she became aware of Gaultier's voice carrying across the ambient sound of the room, not loudly enough to draw general attention, but loudly enough for her to hear as she passed. He was speaking to the junior associate on his left. His voice had the particular quality of someone who knows they can be overheard and considers this an advantage. The service industry selects for a specific kind of person, he was saying, not unintelligent necessarily, but fundamentally limited. They have a ceiling. It's structural. They've chosen comfort over ambition, and they'll spend their careers carrying plates for people who didn't. The associate nodded in the way of junior associates everywhere. It's actually quite useful, Gaultier continued, cutting his halibut with unnecessary precision. When you understand that the person serving you has already accepted the upper limit of their own potential, you stop expecting anything beyond the mechanical. It makes the transaction cleaner. Sylvie set the bread basket down on the sideboard beside his table to refill it. She was close enough that there was no possibility he didn't know she could hear him. That was, she understood clearly, the point. She reached for the sourdough and said nothing. And then Maximilien Gaultier set down his fork and turned slightly in his chair and said, in flawless, unhurried French, the particular French of someone formally educated, not conversational French. Something that she recognized with a jolt of cold clarity as Latin. Asinus in cathedra sedens doctorum se putat. A donkey sitting in a professor's chair thinks itself a scholar. He was smiling, very slightly, at the associate across from him, and the associate was nodding, and Hélène had gone very still in the way of someone who had just understood something and wished she hadn't. Maximilien Gaultier had made a calculation. He had looked at a young woman in a server's apron and black trousers and decided, with the comfortable certainty of a man who had never once been wrong about such things in his own estimation, that she was not the sort of person who had studied Latin, that she would hear sounds and not words, that she would stand there and continue to place bread in the basket while he articulated, in the private language of people who consider themselves educated, exactly what he thought of her. It was not the first time Sylvie Marchand had been underestimated. It was not even the 100th. But it was, she would reflect later, the one that cost him the most. She finished placing the bread. She straightened up. She looked at Maximilien Gaultier directly, which she had not done once in the previous 90 minutes, and she said in Latin, without raising her voice, without any particular inflection of satisfaction, simply clearly, simply correctly, stultum e finge quod vitare non possas. It is foolish to pretend you cannot avoid what you can. The table went silent. Not the gentle silence of a pause in conversation, but the sudden, total silence of a room in which something unexpected has happened, and no one has yet decided how to respond to it. Gaultier stared at her. He had the expression of a man who had reached for something on a shelf and found it wasn't there. The bread basket has been restocked, Sylvie said, in English, pleasantly. Can I bring anything else for the table? No one answered. Hélène was looking at the tablecloth again, but this time, Sylvie thought the quality of her attention was different. There was something in it that might have been the beginning of a smile. Sylvie walked back to the service station. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. What she didn't see, because her back was turned, was the man who had been sitting at the small table for two near the east window, dining alone, who had set down his own fork at the precise moment she had responded, and who was watching her cross the room with an expression that was very difficult to read, but was, if anything, one of careful attention. His name was Frédéric Lalonde. He was 51, and he had the quiet presence of someone who had spent decades learning when to speak and when to watch, which is to say, he was very good at his work, which was, though no one at Auberge Sainte-Hélène outside of the owner knew this, the evaluation and potential acquisition of restaurant groups for a hospitality investment fund based in Quebec City. He had come to the auberge 3 times in the past 2 months. He had eaten quietly, observed carefully, and written nothing down while he was in the room, because he had also learned that the most important things are rarely the things that end up in reports. He had been watching Table 7 for most of the last hour, not because he was particularly interested in Gaultier, whom he recognized and had done business with briefly, unhappily, some years ago. He had been watching because of the server. The way she moved through a difficult situation, with a composure that was not the composure of someone suppressing feeling, but the composure of someone who had assessed the situation and decided how to conduct herself within it, which is a different thing entirely and considerably rarer. The Latin had confirmed something he had already been thinking. He left at 10:15, after a dessert of maple creme caramel and a coffee, and he stopped briefly at the host's stand to ask François for the card of whoever managed staffing for the auberge. François, who had himself witnessed the exchange at Table 7 from across the room, and had spent the intervening 90 minutes managing a complex set of feelings about it, provided the card. At Table 7, the meal had continued with a specific kind of silence. Gaultier had eaten his halibut without further comment. The junior associates had talked quietly to each other about something that was not the thing that had just happened. Hélène had ordered a second glass of the Pouligny Montrachet, and when Sylvie brought it, had looked at her and said, quietly, "It's an excellent choice of wine. Thierry chose it," Sylvie said. "He has good instincts." "So do you," Hélène said, and picked up her glass. When the bill came, it was processed without incident. Gaultier signed without looking at the amount, which was something he always did, and which always meant the same thing. The cost was not the point. He was gathering his coat when he turned, and for the second time that evening, looked directly at Sylvie. "Where did you study?" he asked. The question came out differently than he had intended it to. She could hear the slight recalibration in his voice, the place where certainty had been, and something less comfortable had replaced it. "McGill," she said. A pause. "Law. Law." He looked at her for a moment in the way of a man performing in real time a calculation he had not expected to need to perform. Then he put on his coat and left without saying anything else. The junior associates followed. Hélène paused at the door and turned back briefly, not quite long enough to constitute a conversation, but long enough to constitute an acknowledgement, and then she was gone too. Sylvie cleared the table. She stacked the plates in the order she always stacked them. She folded the linen the way she had been taught, and she brought the tray back to the service station, and then she went to check on Table 9, who were celebrating a retirement and were on their 3rd bottle of champagne, and were the sort of guests who made the other sort bearable. She got the call 11 days later. It came through the auberge's owner, Marguerite, who was the kind of woman who had built a restaurant on the principle that excellence at every level of an organization was not idealism but strategy, and who had hired Sylvie partly because of her references and partly because of something in the way Sylvie had answered, during her interview, the question of what good service actually meant. Sylvie had said, "It means the guest leaves feeling that their evening mattered, not because you flattered them, because you were actually present." Marguerite had hired her that afternoon. Now Marguerite was calling to say that she had received an inquiry from a Frédéric Lalonde, of Lalonde Hospitality Partners, who was in the early stages of developing a new concept, a mid-size restaurant group that would, if it came together as envisioned, operate across 3 cities, Montreal, Quebec City, and Ottawa, and who was looking, as part of that development, for someone to take on a role in operations and guest experience that was significantly larger than what it sounded like. He was very specific, Marguerite said. He asked about you by name. Sylvie was sitting in her car in the parking lot behind the auberge, still in her work clothes, and the October night was cold enough that she had turned the engine on for the heat, and the windshield was still slightly fogged at the edges, and she said, "I don't understand. He was here the night of the Gaultier table," Marguerite said. "He said he watched you manage a very difficult situation and that he found it instructive." Sylvie was quiet for a moment. "He's proposing a preliminary conversation," Marguerite said. "I told him I would pass the message along. What you do with it is entirely yours." After she hung up, Sylvie sat in the car for a while longer. She thought about her mother, who was in remission, who had taken up gardening in the small backyard of the house in Verdun with an enthusiasm that felt, after 2 years of everything that had preceded it, like something precious. She thought about Theodore, who was finishing his electrician's certification, and who called every Sunday and who had said to her, 6 months ago, unprompted, "You know you don't have to keep doing the restaurant thing forever, right? I know why you did it. I know what you gave up. But you don't owe us that forever." She thought about the dining room of Auberge Sainte-Hélène, which she genuinely loved, and about the particular satisfaction of a service that ran exactly as it should, and about how she had sometimes stood at the service station in a quiet moment and thought about the seminar room at McGill and wondered whether those 2 things, the precision of good service and the precision of good legal reasoning, were really as far apart as people assumed. She thought about a donkey in a professor's chair. She allowed herself, alone in the fogged car in the parking lot, a small, private smile. Then she picked up her phone and wrote a message to Frederic Lalonde's office, introducing herself and saying she would be glad to arrange a time to speak. The meeting took place on a Thursday morning at a café on Rue Saint-Denis, which was Frederic Lalonde's suggestion, and which Sylvie understood to be a choice that said something deliberate about the kind of meeting he wanted it to be. Not a formal office conversation, not a performance, just 2 people talking about something real. He was already there when she arrived, with a coffee and a copy of Le Devoir folded beside it, and he stood when she came in, which she noted, and shook her hand, which was firm without being a declaration. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he said. "Thank you for reaching out," she said. She sat down and ordered a café au lait and looked at him across the small table. "Can I ask what it was, specifically, that made you inquire?" He considered the question. He had the manner of someone who takes questions seriously, which she appreciated. "The Latin," he said, "was remarkable, but it wasn't the Latin." She waited. "It was what came after. You brought the bread. You answered his question about the table. You went to check on another guest." He paused. "You didn't need him to know he'd lost. You already knew. That distinction matters to me in the kind of organization I'm trying to build." Sylvie looked at her coffee. "I've been doing this for 3 years," she said, "and I've spent most of that time thinking it was temporary, that I was waiting to get back to where I was going." She paused. "I think I've been wrong about that, actually. Not about the destination, but about the word temporary." Frederic Lalonde nodded, slowly. "Tell me about the destination." So she told him. She told him about the administrative law seminar and the 7:43 a.m. phone call and the chum parking lot and the $64,000. And she told him about her mother's garden and Theodore's Sunday calls, and the particular satisfaction of a well-run service, and she told him what she had said to Marguerite during her interview about what good service actually meant. He listened without interrupting, which was the correct thing to do, and when she finished, he said, "The operations role I'm describing is not a consolation prize for someone who couldn't do something else. It requires exactly the combination of things you've just described: legal and analytical thinking, genuine understanding of how a room works at the human level, and the ability to remain present and effective when the situation is difficult. I've been looking for someone with that combination for 8 months. I'd need to finish my degree," she said. "Eventually, I'd expect nothing less," he said. "We can structure the role to accommodate that." Outside on Rue Saint-Denis, a cyclist rang their bell at a delivery truck, and someone's dog was pulling at its leash toward a patisserie, and the October light was doing the specific thing it does in Montreal in the fall, where it comes in low and golden and makes even the ordinary things look considered. "I have one question," Sylvie said. "Go ahead. Maximilien Gaultier, you mentioned you've crossed paths." Frederic Lalonde was quiet for a moment, briefly. "Several years ago. It didn't go well." He looked at her steadily. "Is that relevant to your decision?" "No," she said. "I just wanted to know if you knew what kind of person he was before that evening, or if it came as a surprise." "It didn't come as a surprise," he said. "Good," Sylvie said. She picked up her café au lait. "Neither did I." She gave Marguerite 4 weeks' notice, which was 2 more than required, because Marguerite had given her something that mattered, and Sylvie understood the value of what she'd been given. Her last service at Auberge Sainte-Hélène was a Saturday in late November, and the dining room was full in the particular way it always was on winter Saturdays, warm and loud and full of people who had made reservations weeks in advance because they understood what they were getting. And at the end of the night, after the last table had gone and the room was being reset, François opened a bottle of the Pouligny Montrachet that Thierry had recommended for Gaultier's table, and they all had a glass at the service station, and Marguerite said simply, "You were exactly what this place needed while you were here, and that was enough." What Sylvie would think about later. Not that night, but later, in the particular quiet of a Tuesday afternoon when she was sitting in a meeting room in Quebec City, reviewing the operational framework for the first of the 3 restaurants in Frédéric's group, was not the Latin and not Gaultier's face when he heard it, though she thought about that sometimes with the clean satisfaction of something correctly resolved. What she thought about most, in the end, was the moment before. The moment when she'd been standing at the sideboard with a bread basket, hearing herself described as structurally limited, as someone who had accepted a ceiling and had understood, with a clarity that came from somewhere below thought, that the ceiling he was describing was entirely his own. She had known that. She had known it before the Latin and after it. She had known it in the parking lot in her fogged-up car, and she had known it sitting across from Frédéric Lalonde on Rue Saint-Denis, and she knew it now in this meeting room where the St. Lawrence was grey-blue and enormous through the window, and her name was on the organizational chart on the wall behind her in a position that did not have a ceiling. Some people, she had come to understand, move through the world with their arms out, testing for limits. She had never been one of them. She had always known, without needing to test, that the space around her was larger than whatever someone else decided to put in it. That was the thing Maximilien Gaultier had not been able to calculate. Not because he lacked the intelligence, but because you cannot calculate what you have never imagined.